Welcome, everyone. We'll give ourselves a couple of minutes to have folks join, and we'll start promptly on the hour. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our fifth annual What Do Canadians Really Think About Climate Change? And my name is Amber Bennett. I'm the Executive Director of Re.Climate. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are based at Carleton University, and we are dedicated to the research and practice of climate change communications and engagement. We work with leaders and organizations across the country to increase public understanding of climate change impacts and solutions and build support for action. We develop research such as that which we'll be featuring today, as well as resources. We provide training, and we convene communities of practice and offer a range of strategic services. I am joining you today from Calgary, which is Treaty 7 territories and situated in the traditional lands of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani Nations, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and the Métis Region 3. These lands are my home, and they've sustained me and my family, and I'm grateful, and I acknowledge that this has come at a cost to the people who have been here for thousands of years before me, as well as the animals and the lands that are here. So I would encourage you to take a moment, use the chat. It's always nice to see where people are joining from. So please take a moment to introduce yourselves and acknowledge where you're joining from. And we'll get started shortly. Today's registration numbers were about 925. So that's a big crowd, and we'll give a couple of minutes for people to keep joining. Awesome. So I can see some people starting to introduce themselves. For today, the session is recorded, and we will be sharing a copy of the recording. We'll be sharing a copy of the presentation slides, as well as the report. That's the basis of the content that we'll be covering today. Today's webinar is 75 minutes long, and so we'll have a presentation in the beginning, and then we'll open it up for a discussion, and then we'll have some time for questions. For those of you who don't spend all of your time on Zoom like I do, there is a Q&A function, which is where we will be tracking questions. So on the bottom of the toolbar for Zoom, you'll see the chat function. We encourage you to use the chat, please. We enjoy a lively conversation, but we will be using the Q&A function to track questions and to answer questions. And so we have a few of our team members who are also joining us, and they'll be working to provide answers to some of those questions in real time as well. So again, my name is Amber Bennett. I'm the Executive Director of Re.Climate. And if you're just joining, please take a moment, and we encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat and to share where you're joining from. This is our fifth annual public opinion roll-up. And in my job, I have the privilege of talking to hundreds of people across the country. And I would say that many people at the moment are grappling with the same question. Should we even be talking about climate change? How do we make it relevant? How do we keep it on the political and public agenda? The country's literally on fire. There's a sense that people are uncertain, where Canadians are at. So sometimes it helps to step back and take a look at the evidence. And for those of you who work in this space, you know that there are hundreds of polls and surveys that are published around climate and energy and Canadian opinion every year. And so this year was our fifth time taking a look and looking across those polls. And typically we do that by looking at the previous year, rolling it up, trying to make sense of it, looking for signals, looking for new trends that might be breaking through. And we did that. But then we arrived in March and we felt like 2024 was suddenly very far away. And so we went back into the research and the team took a look also at 2025. So researchers will kind of talk us through the methodology, but I just wanted to say that the ground that we'll be covering will also include some more recent research from this year as well. So the first half of today's webinar, again, we'll be going through those results. We'll open it up for panel discussion, and then we'll have time for questions. And I'm delighted to say that once again, we're joined by Chris Hatch, who is the lead author on the report. He works as a strategic consultant on energy and climate change. He's the former executive editor of the National Observer and was previously executive director of the Rainforest Action Network. He has a background in campaigns and strategic communications on clean energy, climate change, human rights, and environmental issues. He's worked with NGOs, First Nations foundations, governments, and corporations. He is also the author of one of Canada's top climate newsletters. And so if you haven't signed up for that, I encourage you. It's a really helpful shortcut. And that newsletter is called Zero Carbon. And I think we'll pop a link into that in the chat there. We're also joined by Dr. Ghadah Alrasheed. She is our resource and training director at Re.Climate. She supports research, knowledge mobilization, and the development of resources, evidence-based tools, and training programs for Re.Climate's network of more than 5,000 climate influencers. She has a PhD in communications and a wealth of experience spanning academic, federal, NGO sectors, and she brings a unique understanding of effective research and knowledge mobilization in climate communications. So thank you, Ghadah, who oversaw the research and the report development for today. And then finally, we are going to be joined by Dr. Melanee Thomas, who is a political science professor at the University of Calgary. Her research focuses on gender, political behavior, and energy transition in Canadian politics. Her goal is to help identify how Canadians think about themselves in politics, and explain how this is structured by gender, sexism, and racism, and then develop potential solutions that strengthen democratic politics. Her research has been published in Energy Policy, Electoral Studies, Political Behavior, Political Communication, the Canadian Journal of Political Science, and Politics and Gender. So a really knowledgeable, thoughtful group of experts on today's panel. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Chris, to kick us off and talk through some of the results. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. And hello, everyone. What you're going to hear today is basically a review and synthesis of all of the polling that's out there that we could get our hands on, and also some insights from polling that Re.Climate commissioned and some focus groups that we've done. So the basic idea is that we can sort of not look at any specific poll and dig into it, not look at different pollsters' methodologies and online, phone, IVR, all that sort of technical stuff, but step back and look at what's the broad sweep, how are things kind of averaging out. And so the results that we give you are what ones that we feel pretty confident are representative in general terms and trends that are generally right, rather than specifically wrong. And the second thing I'd just like to say as we get started is that I want to acknowledge that there's no sugarcoating that this is a really tough time for climate communicators, and we'll get into some of the tough findings and trends in polling. So it's great that we have almost 1,000 people signed up for this. It's really heartening. I really want to, just say thank you for your fortitude in sticking with this super important issue, even though, there's a lot of headwinds out there, as we all know. So thank you. It's heartening to be in such a large group of people concerned about our common well-being. So let's get into it. On the first slide, um, and this is sort of the overall picture that we want to highlight, is that the priority of that people are putting on climate action has dropped, as you surely know from the cottage industry of media coverage about how this is not an issue in the election, climate concern dropping, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what's important to recognize is that behind some of those headlines, um, there's still very strong support for action on climate change. There's still very strong concern about climate change. So it's mostly a situation where climate concern remains, but is competing with more immediate fears. Over 2/3 of Canadians say they're concerned or very concerned about climate. 7 in 10 view it as a very serious threat. These are super majorities, okay? So it's not like we're as embattled as maybe some of the media coverage would make out. And you probably saw, or you might have seen, that even just this week, Abacus and Clean Energy Canada came out with a new poll finding that only 14% of Canadians want the government to do less on climate change and clean energy. On the next slide, we just sort of identify, in a snapshot, the headwinds and tailwinds. There is a decline in public prioritization of climate programs, and economic fears have certainly driven an increase in people's belief that the fossil fuel industry and infrastructure is important both to our economy now and going forward. There is also ongoing broad support for renewables and clean energy, which has actually barely shifted during the declines that we see on other metrics. And there is an increase in public anxiety about extreme weather and climate impacts, and more people making the connection and concerned that things are going to get worse. So we'll go quickly now to some of the concerning trends. I'm not going to dwell on them, but here's one point we wanted to make is that, there's a lot been made about the effect, the Donald Trump effect, that, climate has kind of really dropped since tariff threats and all of that. In fact, this is a bit of a longer trend. What you see here is the last few years up until the summer of 2024, so last year, so well even before the US election, a gradual decline. What we think really is going on is that since COVID, and particularly the inflation driven by the pandemic, people have more immediate fears. They're more concerned about cost of living. This has several kind of effects, as you see on the next slide. It just shifts people's priorities. So, the main thing to look at are the two on the left: creating economic growth. If you look at 2023, so inflation is already fully a big issue, right? People are really worried about cost of living, to March of 2025. So, basically now, an enormous jump in the priority on creating economic growth. So this is, in large part the Trump effect. And on second from the left, reducing carbon emissions. And this is obviously super critical for all of our work. People are deprioritizing. When you give them a list of what are the important things that should be taken into account when we do energy policy, reducing carbon emissions has dropped by over 10 points just recently. When people's priorities shift, if you look at the next slide, other things happen. And what we think is going on here, what you see is that the amount of people who think climate is a very serious threat has dropped. And this is probably a function of motivated reasoning. so that if you deprioritize something, you find reasons in your own mind, even if subconsciously, to justify that. On the next slide, you'll see another outcome of this effect. There's actually been a decline in the number of people that say that climate change is caused by human activities. It's very worrying, of course, because it goes to people's mental model of what the solutions are. Um, and as you know, if you were to ask any scientists that study this stuff, um, in fact, climate change that we're seeing is entirely caused by human activities. On the next slide, um, this is some polling that we commissioned with Environics, looking at the cause of climate change, which, as you all know, is primarily the burning of fossil fuels. And what we were interested in finding out is whether Canadians understood that. And we really, like, if anything, we torqued this question because we gave people the answer and told them to pick. And what you see is that not quite half of people did actually pick burning fossil fuels as the leading cause of climate change. That is to say that over half, or roughly half, did not pick it off the list, which obviously is, something that we need to shore up in terms of people's models of what needs to be done. And goes some way to explaining why when you talk to people about the solutions to climate change, they usually start talking about recycling. Okay, on the next slide, we'll move to where public opinion is strong. And as we touched on, general concern is strong. Concern is a weird term that pollsters like to use, but it bundles together a lot of different things. Concern can mean, how top of mind the issue is, how salient it is. It can mean how much of a threat you think it is. It's influenced by how much effect you think you personally or your government can have on it. But broadly speaking, we're talking about supermajorities. 76% concerned about its impact on future generations of Canadians, not just people around the world. So the concern is still there and latent and to be activated and mobilized. That's one of the main takeaways we hope you have from this session today. Another place public opinion is strong, you see on the next slide, is that climate impacts. People understand that climate impacts, especially fires, are getting worse. And people think that that's going to keep happening. It's going to happen more in the future than it is now. So, in that sense, the mental model is quite strong and gives you something to work with for sure. Let's go to the next slide. Public opinion also, held very consistently for clean energy, clean technologies. This is, an extraordinary level of support, much higher than for fossil fuels. And one thing to really note is that it hasn't really dropped at all, even while, economic concerns rise, importance of reducing carbon emissions may have dropped. The support for clean energy is really high and really solid and has not really been impacted very much at all. And next, we will hand it over to Ghadah to highlight some of interpret some of this in terms of how we communicate.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Ghadah, and I'm based in the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people here in Ottawa. So my role today is really to open the conversation about where do we go from there, that we have heard some of these findings from Chris. What kind of strategies, what kind of approaches or tools that can help us move forward. And when we were doing this research with my colleagues and co-researchers, including Dr. Emma Bider, who is part of our team, there were really moments that really stuck with us, and sometimes it hit hard That's because we know how hard people are working to raise concerns about climate change. And we see it every day in the work of our network members, whether municipal staff doing what they can do to keep the climate action on the table, organizations doing the heavy lift of advocacy and pushing decision makers and politicians to act, or community members and indigenous communities standing up for the places they love. And this is what makes the findings matter. They show not only what are the public ads, but really this consistent gap that we have seen throughout the years between concern and action, and why the work of so many of you who are with us in the webinar today is really critical and important to close that gap. So here I'll share a few ideas, but of course these are my thoughts. They reflect some of the collective thinking of Re.Climate experts from conversations with researchers, practitioners, and organizations across the country, and from literature reviews that we have done. And the first thing that we want to share, if we can go to the next slide, is that we can't, the next one. Yeah, well, first of all, is that we can't stop talking about climate change. There is probably a temptation right now to shift away from climate language and climate rhetoric, and instead talk through other priorities that we think that are more important for people through affordability or economy. And yes, we absolutely should connect climate change to these issues. People want to hear about solutions that relate to the things they care most about, and that seems the logical or the rational thing to do. And we realize that climate change actually impacts everything, but this doesn't mean to abandon climate change as a core language or core concern. One is really, as Chris has just shown, Canadians really care. The roll-up that we have been doing throughout the 5 years has shown that Canadians still really concerned about climate change. It may be slipping down the priorities, but it really hasn't ever dissipated. And when you dig a little deeper with some demographics, such as parents or women or younger people, then there's even this real anxiety about what's ahead for themselves, for their kids, and for their communities. So, and people are seeing the impact. They're seeing the intensifying wildfires. They're seeing the intensifying other extreme events, and they are making that connection to climate change. And they know that there will be more of these events. And that's why it's important to return again to the big why. What we should abandon, actually, not the climate language or the climate concern, but it's actually the bureaucratic language that has isolated people from engaging with climate change, like net zero, energy transition, or tipping point. And what we can do is that actually shift the discussion to things that resonate with people, that relate more to them. And that's really what motivate people. And this is different than talking to experts or policymakers or scientists where this language makes sense. But when talking to the public, we really should approach them through what they care more about. Potential Energy looked at 5 years of survey data to understand what is working, and what they found is messages that name the damages of climate change consistently and directly really outperform side door messages, or to go through other entries. In a similar vein, Re.Climate research led by Dr. Louise Cremo with Environics revealed also that the biggest motivator for supporting renewable energy wasn't green jobs. It wasn't exactly innovation. It was really wanting the next generation to have access to clean and safe and affordable energy. So really, the people that that we care about, the places that we care about, our children, the future generations this is the biggest motivator for people. And that's what we need to go back more often to. And right now, we know that security and economy and political sovereignty are really major concerns for people. But what climate organizations and communicators can do is to draw attention to the real opportunity in investing in solutions that last, where climate becomes part of the cultural narrative that we are in. That means talking about careers that are not just for now, but that can be, for future generation. It means building stronger cities, and that makes us more independent and make us more strong or stronger and more prepared. And these are the things that will carry us forward in a world where decarbonization is happening and inevitable, and it's happening in other parts of the world. One more thing that while there are national concerns, and climate is one of them, actually what resonates often depends on different factors: where people live, what are their experiences, at what stage of life they are in. And through Re.Climate works with eco analytics, identifying audience segments, we have seen that people have different concerns. For example, one of the segments is of civic nationals who tend to value nature and community and service to others while holding some conservative and nativist values. While there are other segments like progressive activists who are highly engaged, they are more motivated by social justice, climate change, and health. And so the main takeaway here is that there's a bit more work needed to address and understand these audiences and what they value, and think of them as segments rather than just one group. And finally, really, people aren't making decisions only based on what they believe in. They are driven by what others expect of them. And that's where stories really matter. They can show the positive actions that are done by others and that are already happening. And these stories can help and shift what feels normal and possible. And one of the best ways is to highlight the stories from those that are not the familiar champions of climate change or the environment, but those who are quietly leading the way, such as farmers, local business owners, parents, and school. And so we need really more of these stories, which still we don't have enough to shift and share how this is happening and how these people doing it, how they are changing, and how they are preparing themselves and their communities. And back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Ghadah. So just we'll just skip quickly through some of the highlights that we found around policy, attitudes on policies, and attitudes on energy. One key thing, when we go to the next slide, that you'll see is that Canadians look overwhelmingly to the federal government for action on climate change. Now, this might be a function of really nobody knows who does what at any level of detail. But we think, worth highlighting because, so many of us on this call are working with municipal governments, provincial governments, First Nations leadership. And so there's a real probably need to make the case. There's a mental step needed for your audience that it's not only the federal government that has, control over energy, over building codes, over so many of the issues that are important. I think we'll skip this next slide and go to the one after. this is research that was led by Dr. Louise Comeau for Re.Climate, and she did a bunch of focus groups and polling. And what you see here is looking at clean electricity regulations, but it's a finding that is true very broadly, which is that got this huge concern still about climate change, desire for something to be done. But on any given policy, acceptability drops significantly. So clean electricity regulations were found to be acceptable by, only about half of the public. And the main reason that seems to come out in focus groups um, is fairness. So it's a real place to drill into that people think the policies aren't fair. They think the burden is being put on individuals. Fairness plays out in all kinds of different ways, but it's a super crucial quality, especially in terms of Canadians' attitudes that things be fair. So a really important place to shore up messaging and communications and messengers that can carry the message. On the next slide, we'll move to attitudes about energy more specifically. And like we covered, so I won't dwell on it, huge supermajorities want the government to prioritize the development of renewable energy. Solar, wind, things like that are vastly more popular than fossil fuels when you ask people what we should expand. So 77% for solar, 72% for wind, which, as you'll see, compares to, maybe 61% for gas and 51% for expanding oil. Let's go to the next one where we actually do look at that. One of the big jumps actually we've seen, just to note it briefly, is that nuclear power, expanding nuclear power has become much more popular in the last few years, driven largely by men. This is largely a male phenomenon. Let's go to the next, where we look at gas. Important thing to point out here is that 61% of Canadians say they support expanding natural gas, including LNG. If you ask them, do you support expanding fracking? The number drops almost in half. So, really speaks to the importance of how you frame and the key trigger language that you work into communications. The next slide looks at oil. Definitely a large jump. Even just recently, you could call this in part the Trump effect in people's perspective on how important oil and gas are to Canada's future economy. Where it was down at 60, now up to 70. The next slide, as you know from we've skipped over a lot of the regional and gender and age divides because so many of you have been with us on previous webinars where we drilled into those things much more. But it's really worth highlighting that there are huge gender gaps, and especially around energy and fossil fuel production. Expanding natural gas, including LNG, 3/4 of men say they support it, just slightly less than half of women, for example. And on the next slide, this is where I'll finish up, because I know a lot of folks work on, getting people to make changes in their own lives, in their own homes. And we talked about fairness. But here's quite a significant opportunity that we wanted to identify is that when you ask people if they're willing and interested to transition to heat pumps, to solar, to EVs and that kind of thing, there's an enormous latent interest. And half of the people who say they are interested, that say they haven't even started yet. So, when we're looking at places where there's fertile ground to tie into, definitely something to keep in mind there. I think that's my last slide, and we're going back to Ghadah.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. can go just to the next slide, and I'll talk through the next set of recommendations, but there will be only one slide. And just say, just because Chris, you handed on the part of the personal energy transition, I was in Reddit a few days ago, just curious to see what people are saying about switching to heat pumps and other electrification technologies. And I came across a thread for homeowners in Ontario, and they were talking about or sharing stories about shifting from gas furnaces to heat pumps, and how much did it cost, how they access the Greener Homes Grant, which I believe is closed now. But I think that what really stood out is that it wasn't like talking about money was just really a small thing in that thread. Rather, the people in the thread talked about how it made their homes quieter, or the heat pump made their homes more comfortable, how it survived a couple of winters and it's been working fine with them, how they did that decision or made that decision because they heard from people on Reddit or heard from neighbors. And also, one of the interesting stories that I found was someone who said that the biggest barrier was not the technical, was not the money aspect, but it was really getting the contractor on board, because they were really resistant to installing a heat pump. And so they had to do a few things just to convince the contractor and make them feel better about having the heat pump. And these stories really capture what we have seen in the research. And the research that is done by Re.Climate, which Chris just referred to, but other folks like Dr. Katya Rodas and Aaron Hoyle. And the main insights from the research is adopting clean technologies and supporting electrification technologies isn't just about really the money. It's about whether the technology feels like something that's going to work for them, whether they can it feels like a reliable choice, whether the others are doing it, whether the process is straightforward and doable. And this is different than traditional techno-economic models, which assume that people weigh cost and benefits perfectly, and that just people's goal is really to maximize their gain and benefit. However, behavioral and social science research shows that there are many effective and social factors that influence how people make decisions and judgments about transitioning to a clean or electrification technologies. And one of these factors is really the perception of fairness, which Chrissy just mentioned. When people engage with climate policies, particularly, really, they need to know who benefits, who bears the cost, who gets to be part of the decision making. So it's really important for decision makers to be transparent about their policies and what these policies are trying to achieve and who is impacted in the process. And this fairness aspect is not only in how we discuss and communicate the policies, but is really important of how this policy is designed and implemented, and how that fairness is shown and clear to people through these processes. It also matters who's speaking to people, and to be really present when people weighing the options, when they plan to upgrade their homes. We need to speak to them, or have installers and technicians and contractors who can answer people questions, who show the benefit of moving to other cleaner options. And just quick, and then I'll leave it to the discussion with to the questions from folks with and the discussion with Melanee and Chris, is that while fairness matters, frames matter, trust matters. Still, there are still key facts about climate change that really matter. And research from George Mason Center for Climate Change Communications show that believing in 6 key truths about climate change really play a central role in how people support climate policies. They are simple, but they really matter, that climate change is real, that it is caused by humans, that scientists agree that climate change is happening and caused by humans, that it harms people, and that there are others who care and they are doing things about it, and there are solutions. So these 6 beliefs are really important to build that support for climate policies and to have people accept the energy transition. And I'll go back to you, to Amber, to guide us for the rest.
Well, thank you, Ghadah. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to invite our third panelist, Dr. Melanee Thomas, on to join us. And yeah, we'll take the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes. We'll have a discussion. And just a reminder, we're using the Q&A function to track questions. It's been a lively chat, and so I see that there are some really great questions that are happening in the chat, but move those over to the Q&A, and we'll do our best to leave some time for that. So I think that we've kind of touched a little bit on this, but there as a general sense that we are in a moment in which affordability, cost of living, the economy is taking center stage, and communicators are wondering, where does climate fit into all of this? And certainly, where does climate fit in the context of some of the trends, Chris, that you've been talking about? So Melanee, I'm going to go to you first and give you a chance to join the conversation. But in your opinion, kind of given the current economic and political climate, what advice do you have for communicators on how to make climate change more relevant, more resonant, not only just for Canadians, but I would say for politicians and political leaders? So over to you, Melanee.
Yeah, so 2 things. I know this came up in the presentation, but when I looked at the data initially, my first interpretation of it was how stable it was over time, and also how many supermajorities of support in terms of like believing that climate change is anthropogenic, to think that we need to like do something about it. Some of the changes that we've seen, I do think some of those changes are real over time, but also like in terms of like, there's that very first slide that Chris showed that tracks things over time, where there's the high of 87 and now we're at 63. Like that's a real change, except that we point out that we're dealing with supermajorities in all of these contexts, right? Which means that the good news is that most folks are on side with all of this information. Other things in terms of like, I don't see the information on changing opposition in particular is something that strikes me as trendless fluctuation. So you see changes that are like 1 to 3 percentage points, but the way that it varies suggests that that's something that comes with sampling and not a genuine kind of change. So good news is that like the foundation that was there is still there. Fair. The not so good news, and this is where I suspect I will be talking about partisanship a lot. So welcome to the first statement of what might be a broken record. We're in a moment where conservative parties, and I would say parties that are on like the right of the political spectrum, are in a conservative party family, which there's like iterations and variations. Like not all conservatives are the same, just like not all centrists and left-leaning parties are the same. But we're in a moment where conservatives are either winning elections or they are expecting or expected to win elections. And this is one of the reasons why the rhetoric has shifted in a context, and the political communication and the political branding and marketing is shifting into a context where that's where, like, that's why it all sounds like we're talking like the kind of like ideational context has shifted. And so in this context, I think I would say that there's a difference between like what people are thinking and feeling and what political leaders think that they need to say to win elections. And the stuff that people think that they need to say to win elections is much more variable than what people think and feel. And so in that sense, like it makes it a bit of by a bit of a challenge. I don't mean to underpin that. I don't know if we showed the slide. I was busy answering Q&A things, so I don't know if we saw the slide that showed how like these things are affected by partisanship, but like conservative partisans are hostile. And so this is where I would say there's nothing specific about places like Alberta and Saskatchewan that's unique to Alberta and Saskatchewan about this. It just happens to be that there's lots of partisans there. And so what you're getting is a kind of partisan reaction. Things like vote choice are complicated, and the parts. So what I'm seeing here in lots of the data that were presented are the things that are stable that lead to stability in political behavior. And then the communications and the rhetoric is where the changeable stuff is. And the kicker is that elections, and before somebody says, if we just had PR, it would all be fine, the answer is no. If you change whoever is in government, you can have massive changes in how the policy and stuff like that gets presented very quickly. And so I would look at this as the best way for me to understand these data and how I'm not a professional communicator, so take me with that caveat. But the way that I'm looking at this, it would be, how would I vary the messaging to be true to the foundations while also dealing with the changing partisan context? And so I know I put this in the Q&A, but I think it's something that's worth mentioning several times. Like it's an important point. When government tries to do policy interventions and then they decide that those policy interventions don't work, one of the things that they need to be pushed on is, okay, so what are you replacing it with though? And this is where I think these data give like lots of, as you can say, super majorities of Canadians consistently want you to act on this. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, nobody likes the consumer carbon tax. I remember being at a political science conference in 2011 or 2012, and a group of Swedes were looking at like public opinion on their gas tax. And even so, I'm from Alberta, born and raised. We are very immature when it comes to taxes. We want to have the nicest of everything. We don't want to pay our fair share of taxes. The Swedes are like the opposite of this. Like if you're talking to a Scandinavian context, they understand that you have to pay for stuff, and you do that through the tax system. Even the Swedes hated the carbon tax, especially on like fuel for vehicles, right? Even in a context where they're much more successful about doing some of these transitions at the consumer level, at like the state level than what we are. And so the nugget I would take from this is that, okay, proved not to be popular. Not surprised that like to win elections, people made changes or changes about those policies. But where I feel a vacuum is this on a push being kind of like, so what are you doing instead? So you took that off, but you still need to do something because look at these supermajorities. So what is that being replaced with? Yeah. And then the only other thing I would say is that with folks, I can imagine people might be feeling quite demoralized because of the way that the kind of like partisan political winds are shifting. I would expect conservative party families to be hostile. The data suggests that that is where their bread and butter is. And so part of this is going to be, how do you build, sustain, keep the hopes up of like this base, which is the overwhelming majority of folks, while also ensuring that there's a position to continue to keep doing the policy interventions that need to be done.
Okay, thank you. Chris, I'm just curious, you've offered some perspectives as you've presented the data, but on this question from your perspective, and as somebody who's tracking kind of climate news, what do you think? What's your advice for communicators around how to make climate and energy transition more resonant, not only for Canadians, but and also for politicians?
Yeah, well, I really loved Melanie's where she landed on, if you're not going to do this, what are you going to do? That does feel like a vacuum. One of the big things that I feel like cuts through almost all communication. Where I feel like there's a lack is that it's kind of presented often from a sort of embattled perspective, not necessarily explicitly, but
Mhm.
one of the big problems we have is we have these super majorities, right? And people don't actually see that out in the world. They don't talk about it with their friends. They don't feel like they're in a super majority. And by and large, I would say the communications coming out on climate don't shore up people's sense. The academics talk about is pluralistic ignorance. You're really worried about something, but you think nobody else is. And so you feel really alone, and so you're paralyzed. And I think it is really important to build the sense that you're joining millions of people,
Mhm.
you know, and
Yeah.
of course, everyone finds ways to express this that are authentic to them. But, it could be that you're joining the millions of Canadians. It could be that, take whatever poll you want and, percentage and multiply the population of Canada and give an exact number. You're joining the 28 million Canadians that want action on X. Yeah, so I think cutting into this pluralistic ignorance is just like a really fundamental thing. It's like we're not trying to achieve something from a position of weakness. We are
Mhm.
trying to exert the will of a supermajority. And I think we want to couch our communication more in that sense. And that gets us, kind of to Melanie's point of being able to say, okay, so what are you going to do? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
28 million Canadians want action.
Yeah.
What
Well,
up?
certainly the social science would be behind you, that kind of that sense of belonging and the need to belong is one of a core motivations of humans. So we want to belong to a group. So it's a great advice, and kind of normalizing that and normalizing what people are doing. Ghadah, before I move on, I'm just curious if there's anything that you'd add that you feel you want to either reassert from the recommendations that you covered earlier, or anything that that's come up for you that's new.
I would echo what Melanie and Chris really mentioned and what you just, Amber, mentioned. I think it's just like I feel that climate organizations and climate communicators in general feel like there's this that we are in a competition and we need to get people over from that space to that space. So it's like we need to win people over. And I just, is just that we need to kind of, I think the work that needed to be done is to blur these boundaries and make climate, just show more what's climate change is doing. How is it impacting our healthcare system? How is it, partly the source of or the inflation problem that we have? How is it, affecting our economy, or how is it going to affect more all of these? So really blurring these boundaries, I feel like that's one thing that we can do more. And I would say is that while there are national kind of, there are things that, cut across all the regions, there are communities for whom energy transition or shifting from fossil fuels to renewables is not really an opportunity, is a threat. That's what it feels
Mhm.
to them, that they're going to lose their, their jobs, they're going to lose their state, their sense of identity. And so we need to really to speak to those who feel that and acknowledge these feelings and make the process seems like something that is done with them rather than to them. And so it's not one approach to all regions, but really to think about how these regions are impacted and what we can do to address the concerns that people have. And just keep in mind that while these people have these concerns and these seems as threatening things, there are populist actors who are feeding these fears, who are, exaggerate these fears. So paying attention to that part
Mhm.
is really important, especially if climate again remains in this bureaucratic, policy-dominated language. It'll continue disconnected from people's life, and while populist voices are telling highly emotional, highly relatable stories about their communities.
Thanks, Ghadah. Well, kind of, I guess, kind of in that vein, we did get quite a few questions tied to the relationship and whether or not we can draw a relationship between public opinion and the media ecosystem. And I know, Ghadah, you've actually been doing quite a bit of work around populism and in this topic. So I'm just going to invite you to kind of keep talking about a little bit. So from your perspective, what do you see as the relationship between public opinion and kind of our current media ecosystem?
Um, I think that's a really good question of like, especially that a lot of people are thinking about the role of media and should we pay more attention to mainstream media? Should we monitor what mainstream media are doing? Or should we put our efforts in engaging with people around, social media and these platforms where conversations are really happening? And I think that I think it's just the understanding that is needed to develop around that really it is a circular process of how the media and the public opinion fit into each other. Public opinion really sets the agenda for media sometimes, and that's what people, will make people talk about things. But also media sometimes is just play a role in shaping what people think. And so but and while that circular or that is happening, it's not a balanced situation. So not all institutions, not all power or platforms have the same level of power. Some are more influential than others. And I think is that what climate organizations and communicators is that to think about is that when when they engage with media, there's a need, and I wouldn't say that this is the work of these organizations, but I think probably there's more of academics and researchers also weighing in, is that it's not studying just this, mainstream media or like social media, but really mapping out how information goes from here to there. What are the channels going through? How a message gets amplified? Because in many cases, messages on social media get amplified by mainstream media or vice versa. So it's really important to look at that process and who's influencing and what is happening. And and it's really a work that is still going. And I would say that needs to be done. But let's assume that we have only trusted institutions that are that are doing that work, that we don't have misinformation, or that we don't have social platforms, but really we have institutions that are or legacy media that where people get information from. Will we have a better informed public? And I think the answer would be yes and no. Definitely, it will be more informed if we are going to sources of information that are trustworthy, and so people are not confused. But we have done media analysis of the biggest media institutions here in Canada, and we still found gaps in how mainstream media that like the Globe and Mail and CTV and all these mainstream institutions, and these gaps are really parallel what we see in the public opinion research. That confusion or softening belief about the fossil fuels, the role of climate change. So it's really that work need to be done of like making mainstream media accountable for the work that they're doing, and really their role in educating the public, I would say, shows in the public research, opinion research that we are doing every year.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, I'm just curious, as somebody who is tracking this conversation in the public and politically and within organizations and the media, what's your sense? And somebody who's been doing this for a few years, what's your sense of the relationship between public opinion and the media ecosystem, and what communicators might be able to do about that?
Yeah, well, I think Ghadah gave a very fulsome answer there. I mean, one thing I really notice is, I have a couple of 20-something kids, and a lot of their information diet now is YouTube, for example. And what's super interesting, though, is that most of the sort of relevant stuff is YouTubers riffing off of, um, you know, almost mainstream media. So it's still playing a hugely influential role, even in this really fragmented um, media environment. And it is, I think, not doing a great job and more vulnerable than people might think to improvement. You know, reporters, editors, um, take that stuff more seriously, take criticism more seriously um, than you might think. And, just finally, I think one of the biggest evidence of how important um, the connection is just the amount of money and energy that the populist right has put into building a media ecosystem, right? And there just is not anything remotely comparable that's supportive of climate action and other related issues. So that's a long-term play, obviously, but one we don't want to cede the ground to this sort of making the weather that people experience become hostile.
So on this, because I see a comment about the reference to heritage media organizations and the kind of work that journalists do. And this is one of the things that um, I find most alarming as a political scientist who studies democracy and like what a robust democracy looks like. There's a reason why free expression and especially a free press is a linchpin for democracy. And I mean, one of the things that I have seen that Donald Trump did very effectively, and I don't want to say that everything is Donald Trump because right now he's super erratic, but note how under Trump 1.0, there was a massive effort put in to build a lack of trust to an explicit hostile distrust of the media. This is designed, I mean, in addition to like the social media and the internet context and the point about YouTube and like where people are getting their information from is spot on. It's precisely because what we used to have was a kind of consensus about like with like variations on a theme in terms of like setting the agenda, framing issues, and like these are like classic media effects that we've studied a lot. And this is where you can get like media biases are like focused on change and negativity. So there's the negativity bias and the change bias, which is like if it bleeds, it leads. But those are the sorts of things that like you would use to structure like the 6 o'clock news or figure out what goes onto the front page. Nobody's going to be like, it continues to be amazing. And that's getting your photo above the fold, right? My point about the lack of trust, though, is that once trust goes, that lack of trust is a crucial antecedent for conspiratorial thinking. And so one of the things that I look for and see, and my colleagues do as well, with alarm, is the deliberate action that's being taken to undermine core tenets of a democratic system. And again, because I suspect it's going to come up from the fair vote folks, this does not include the formula with which you translate votes to seats. There are numbers of legitimate democratic ways to do that. People can have preference. This is not the same as like saying you cannot trust what's on a news report because motivated reasoning then takes over. And like partisan motivated reasoning is a thing. It came up in the Q&A as well. Like assume when we're looking at public opinion that people are not using facts, they are using their identities and the emotions in their head. And those things to them are factual. And so that's the perceptual lens through which people are viewing the world. When what conspiratorial thinking is an extreme form of motivated reasoning, and that lack of trust is that crucial antecedent to it. And so what you have in the information environment now is one that's incredibly fractured. Journalists are desperately trying to do the job that they don't have the resources to do, especially at the local level, and our democracy catastrophically suffers for it. And then you have all the people with resources who are engaging in disinformation, misinformation, disinformation. Like disinformation is like you want people to draw the wrong conclusion, and misinformation is when somebody thinks that they get it and then they unwittingly spread the lack of information, right? Social media is good for this, but the actors with deep pockets are engaging in the disinformation there. And so you've got this like dual sort of thing where it's like you need to watch the people who are doing this deliberately, and then also have like the care and sensitivity for the people who've actually gone down the rabbit hole. And the thing to get them out of it is trust plus a different information diet. This is why things like I don't remember the name of the legislation, but this is why why you can't post news links on Facebook anymore. That's why that legislation was so important, because it makes people like Meta and Google pay so that we actually have the resources to do proper journalism in this kind of context where the advertising funding model is busted. But for this particular crowd, and I mean, part of this is going to be like trust is the biggest thing. And so if people don't trust you, they're not going to listen to you. And it's worse than that. If they don't trust you and you say something and they decide they don't agree with it, and then you get this like crazy hostile blowback, that's conspiratorial thinking. And the crux to that is trust.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to encourage panelists to have quick and snappy answers. We're going to try to get through some of these. I'm going to actually, Melanee, just keep going with you here. So a question here from Anne, curious to know if there's any research on the public's perceptions of the oil and gas industry itself. I'd be interested to know, for instance, if there are differences in how people answer a question about support for LNG versus a question about their views on the gas industry itself. So Melanee, over to you.
I mean, I want to say not a lot. I feel like we're behind on this. When my team first started looking at energy transition, I thought I was just really bad at my job because I couldn't find the previous studies that actually asked people what they thought about explicitly moving away from fossil fuels. I was like, surely before 2018, 2019, someone had asked that. And I had a conversation with Eric Lachapelle at the University of Montreal, which some folks might know him. And he said, we didn't want to build the opposition's cases for it. And so I suspect one of the reasons why people are behind in the public opinion on this is that people are worried that they might build the case. Now, I have like trust measures in my own work. I ran a quick, not something I would publish, but just to see what the distribution is. And I would not, people don't trust the oil and gas industry. Like they trust scientists more, but they trust oil and gas more than they trust the federal government, which it tells you something about partisan motivated reasoning and how much everybody also hates politicians. My apologies to the politicians who are in, but part of me is also kind of like, I suspect that you knew this depending on what comes into your office and the like. I feel like there's also lots of motivated reasoning on this. So if you look at like the gender differences in support for LNG, or even things like nuclear, or opposition to things like solar, I think a bunch of this is related to the like what people perceive to be a good job, where they perceive status and privilege. Like I see lots of status threat. Status threat is this idea of like people being very reactive to and change that they anticipate that's going to like make the power structure more meritorious. So the backlash against EDIA or DEI, this is motivated by status threat. Voting for Donald Trump back in 2016, 100% motivated by status threat. And so I would not, again, if I could highlight one thing, it's the image that people have in their heads and the emotions that they have attached to that drives a lot of this, including fear. Climate folks know to not necessarily prey on people's fears, but also know in a partisan context, or if people are like, if I was going to be really quite unkind about the folks that support metallurgic coal mining on the eastern slopes of the Rockies, it is this entitlement to a high school diploma gets me the kind of job as a man that lets me spend over $100,000 on a truck and have a snowmobile and have a fifth wheel and have a spouse that gets to stay home and do all my housework. Like it's fringy, certainly, it doesn't match the economic reality of the world, but I live and play in these areas, and like that's the attitude. It's emotional, it's about status, it's about power. And
okay.
That was
Okay.
your quick Northampton. I'm so sorry.
Chris, I'm going to go here for you. Quick question from David Hawking. Simple. Which works better for intuitive public support, clean energy or renewable energy? Any sense of the difference in terms of language and or the concept itself?
Clean.
Clean. Thank you.
And it, there's related things. There's nothing like wrong with renewable, but it is kind of coded weak in a lot of contexts. The BC government did a bunch of work. That's why their program is called Clean BC, and landed on clean. And there's a bunch of related points that are super important, right? That this is energy that's available domestically, available forever, affordable, all that kind of stuff that can be tagged onto it.
Okay, thank you. A question here for you, Ghadah. Quick. How many are aware of the magnitude of climate change-induced effects on health, and that the WHO ranks climate change the #1 public health threat? I know that you've been doing quite a bit of work recently around this. Any studies that come to mind or your sense of this question?
Well, there's definitely awareness of health impacts. I would say definitely air quality, asthma. These are more salient for people, but there are other health impacts that are really not still clear. The impact of like the mental health impact on infrastructure, health infrastructure, and how would that create some problems. These are definitely some gaps. But I would say it's really an area of research. I found a bit of difficulty finding research that tracking really the impact. For example, infectious diseases. What is the level of people's knowledge of the impact of climate change on infectious diseases? This is still an area I haven't found many sources, and please share with me, help to the folks who are here in the health domain, if there are works that address these, but I haven't found much resources on these specific, conditions. But I mean, there's tons on asthma, on lung and heart diseases, but not as many as in other where I understand it's evolving research, but I think we need also more on these to catch up on what the impact would be.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for a couple more quick questions. Evan Ferrari here, Chris, over to you. Could the massive success of fossil fuel industry misinformation play into pluralistic ignorance that you're referring to? So, Chris, I think the question here is, what's the influence of fossil fuel advertising on our sense that we're the only people who care?
Yeah, I think it's huge. It's a really important point, and it's still ongoing. It's on buses all around where I live, and really speaks to the importance of getting at these really fundamental, not forgetting the most sort of fundamental aspects of communication, of that we're coming from a place of a supermajority. Cracking this pluralistic ignorance point is, we're not fighting from a place of weakness. We're asserting the strength of a supermajority. And this basic notion of, when we set out the recommendations, we really recommend people look at, telling a story of what's the problem, what's causing it, what's the solution. And we have a real breakdown on cause. It's still super, super important to emphasize that the main cause is the burning of fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chris. All right. So I'm going to wrap it up here. We have 3 minutes. We always commit to getting people back to the rest of their day. I would like to just remind people that we will have the recording available. We will share the report. And we will be digging into a number of the trends over the next few weeks with some deep dives in our blog. And we also are really appreciative of your feedback. We will include a survey when we end. And so we're looking for your feedback and your sense of what helps, and also what other types of topics that we might be that would be helpful in the work that you're doing. For those of you who have not been to our website, we do encourage you to go to Re.Climate.ca. There you will find a wealth of information on other topics that we've looked at, such as how to communicate affordability, some of the breakdown on the 5 Canadas and segmentation. And also for those of you who do not yet follow us on LinkedIn, we encourage you to do that. We are often sharing information about upcoming events, not only of our own, but of others. And finally, you can go to our website to sign up for our newsletter, and that will increasingly cover and provide more information on specific topics. We'll be doing some deep dives in our blog through us and some of our guest authors. So thank you very much. We will share a recording. We will share the report, and do go to those places and follow us for more information, and fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks to our panelists, and keep on keeping on.